Hello everybody at Future Primitive. We are doing the fourth talk of Rapture and Revolution, and I'm here with John. We're, I think, at a very exciting place in this series of talks. Up till now, we've spoken about the history of mind-expanding substances, mainly plants, and we've spoken about the effects of them, the connection between the earth and the connection with these substances. We've spoken about what we may see when we expose ourselves to this perception, and now we are going to talk about what we are calling the Planetary Shift Society, or the species. So this is really the practical application or the destructive application of these tools. So, John, how would you like to start this portion?
Thank you, Joanna. I'd like to start by making two remarks. First, briefly, by referring back to the overall title, Rapture and Revolution. I find these two words in juxtaposition to be quite compelling, and I reflect on them a lot. Listeners of the preceding installments of this series will recall, I think, that we said in the first discussion of the Wasson thesis something about this title, and I just want to reiterate that briefly. The title reflects the idea that we have in a great possibility. And this is not our idea of Joanna, Harcourt-Smith, and John Lash, but I would say that it's an idea that we encountered together in our generation. I would say that it's an idea of the 60s generation, which was that by changing consciousness, we could change the world. Now, we understand in the perspective of 40 years of time now, we perhaps understand that with a little more maturity and a little more depth. For one thing, I would say that changing consciousness involves going into ecstasy and trance. That has been the time-tried method. That is the tradition of shamanism. That is the sacred tradition of medicine plants reflected in all indigenous cultures. And so I would add that the experience of rapture is the consciousness-changing experience, the most powerful we know.
Well, I'd like to refer back to Castaneda about this. He spoke about bands, and so I see it a little bit like we are stuck in a radio station, at a particular radio station, and we can be willing to search for other bands and other reception.
Yes, that's brilliant. I find that Castaneda's model is very helpful. Those of us who say Castaneda, by the way, give away our age, because we're old enough to remember when the books came out with a little squiggle over the N. Most people say Castaneda. Anyway, Carlos, or Carlitos, as we like to call him, came up with a fascinating model of bands of emanation, and his description of changing consciousness was very simple. I like to go by Carlos's description of shamanism or sorcery, which is, it's the management of perception. And he spoke of heightened perception as the state that we achieve when we go out of the habitual band that we're in into these other bands. So what we're saying here that integrates closely with Carlos's work is that the sacred plants have been given to us by nature so that we can move through other bands. As human beings endowed with the particular cerebral faculties that we have, and with our language skills and symbol-making skills, we tend to niche ourselves into a certain band that is of our conceptual framework. And the plants, it's as if nature provided us with a means to get over ourselves and get outside of that. And that's what the sacred plants are, but that is not what drugs are. Drugs, most drugs, prescription drugs, laboratory-produced drugs, simply produce an alteration within the band we're in, and they derange that band or give us an illusory sense of flexibility within that band. But what we're talking about, and exactly what Carlos was talking about, is about shifting bands deliberately, moving to other bands of organization, and for instance, seeing the universe in true perceptions and true hallucinations. When shamans paint pictures that show microscopic structure of the universe, it's not an artistic fantasy. They do this, ayahuasca shamans for instance, because they are actually able to directly perceive the molecular structure. I have done that myself. I know that it's a fact. I can do it repeatedly and deliberately, but I cannot do it without the aid of the medicine plants. Likewise, it's possible to perceive on the macrocosmic scale, to look into the interior of the sun, to look at the center of the galaxy. These perceptions are all within the range of the human mind. And what we are proposing in this title, Rapture and Revolution, is that the act of having these perceptions, of doing the practices that it takes, is also connected with the act of revolution and changing the society that we live in. So with that preface, I'd like to go on to the idea of the society versus the species. I brought that notion up as a conflict situation in metahistory a few years ago. And I'd like to just say briefly what I mean by that conflict. It's very simple. If you out there, those of you who are listening to these words, find that in some respects, and perhaps in many respects, you're living in an inhumane society, an inhumane world, then I would ask you, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stay in that inhumane society and try to make it into a humane society? Or are you going to do something else? And if you decide to do something else, what are your options?
Well, I saw this great cartoon in the New Yorker, in the latest copy of the New Yorker, and some of you will understand this joke because I'm not going to elaborate on it, but it's two girlfriends sitting having tea, and one says to the other, well, you're just still angry because he slept with his avatar. And just, you know, like that. Okay, I'll give you a clue. An avatar is another self that you create on the internet. So, okay, well, carry on. So the phenomena of the avatar and many other phenomena of our society linked to electronics and technology are, in my opinion, alienating us from our humanity and from the natural world. Now, this may sound like a hypocritical statement to make because here I am using that very technology to reach you, but that's no big deal. This is no different than a radio. It's no different than forms of communication that have existed for many, many centuries. I'm not opposed to technology per se. I'm opposed to the exaggeration of technology to where it becomes a prosthetic device that replaces our own faculties and replaces our relation to nature, as Marshall McLuhan initially warned. Well, to where it becomes part of our humanity. It is a way to transmit something, but it is not our humanity. Exactly. That's a beautiful distinction. Here we are, you know, doing our level best to be human on the internet and using the technology and to a certain extent humanizing it. But I would point out that the dehumanizing effects of electronic technology are enormous, and also the destabilizing and the dematerializing effects. The way that they take us away from our body, take us out of our body and our senses into a kind of pseudo or simulated world is very dangerous. And so it stands to reason that
if this is the case, if we're living in a society dominated by technology, it may tend to go in an inhumane direction. Now, something that Joanna and I have often discussed in the context of the wonderful Marian Institute that sponsors us is the things that are being done by the Marian Institute that are being sponsored, the programs, to change society and make it better. And at times we felt a little bit uncomfortable with that because we are not actually putting out a message about making society better. We are putting out a message about making another kind of society. So we all face this choice, I think. Do you want to go into society as it is and improve it, or do you want to not make that commitment and put your belief in change and your will for a better future somewhere else? And I think this is a question that's essential to all of us as we're facing the idea of a planetary shift. How do you want to dance your way through that shift? Do you want to stay in a big city, for instance, and develop rooftop agriculture so people can grow their own vegetables in the city? Do you want to improve the conditions of transportation in the city so that there's less use of cars and more use of public transportation? These are ways of working within society to make it better and more humane and safer and healthier. Or do you want to not commit yourself to improving society as it is, but to shoot for something else, to go for something else entirely?
Well, this is what Future Primitive is all about. This is what this website is all about, is bringing information to people from societies that have existed a long time ago and that are being destroyed and have been greatly destroyed, and searching for partners in the present world, in the modern world, that want to create a new way of living together.
Exactly. The mission statement of Future Primitive contains the idea of emergent communities. Some people call these intentional communities, and or eco-villages, and new organization in a planet-friendly environment. So in order to move in that direction, one might very well turn one's back, as it were, on society as it is, that is mainstream society, and go and create another society. An alternative village or eco-village is not a part of society as such. It is an actually different model of society altogether. So this is a choice we all face, and it's one way of looking at where you stand in the planetary shift.
All right, well, let's go back to the evolution of the plants and the materials that were used and are still used by some to perceive the primary religious experience. And in this, I'd like to speak about Timothy Leary, who was actually, both times he was busted in his federal arrest and in his California arrest. It was for infinitesimal amounts of marijuana. There's a book called A Brief History of Drugs by a Spanish author called Antonio Escotado, and he says that in California, Leary was arrested for 1 kilo of marijuana. This is totally and completely untrue. I think I know the history of Timothy Leary better than anybody on this earth at this time, except for probably Michael Horowitz, who was his archivist. And it was 0.1 gram. And this is important because this opens up the horizon for us to talk about the separation between humanity, the human species, and the planet, the earth, the organicness from which we come, of which we are.
Yes, I wanted to mention this book, Brief History of Drugs from the Stone Age to the Stoned Age. It's available from Park Street Press, which is Inner Traditions, and I would recommend it, except for that one very critical error, and perhaps a few other errors of that type, I don't know, but I would recommend the book generally for its overview of the subject, and particularly because it complements something that we've discussed here at several points, namely the prohibition of our access to medicine plants that are known to be completely harmless, non-addictive, known to have healing and enlightening properties, and known to have been used and tested in indigenous cultures for many centuries. And one of the things that Escotado does very well in his book is that he describes in detail, going back to the time of the Opium Wars in the 19th century, the double game that the authorities have always played. The very same religious and government authorities that prohibit natural substances are also profiting from them and using them in their own way behind the scenes. And the whole drug scene, this became apparent to us by the Iran-Contra affair in the United States some years ago, and I think it's more or less common knowledge now to socially enlightened people that the governments who are cracking down on drugs are also in the drug business themselves. And he describes this very, very well in his book, and it's quite an eye-opener. Now, I would like to raise a point to you which I consider to be perhaps one of the more important points in this talk, and that point is, how far are you willing to let it go? Suppose it comes down to a day when you go on the internet and you punch up Google News and it says U.S. government forbids zucchinis and raspberries. How far are you willing to let it go? How far are we as a society of awakening people willing to let this go? It's true that there are it's not easy to protest what a government does, and it takes courage and guts to even do that and to stand up for stand up against the authorities. But the point that I want to make is, in my mind, in my understanding of the critical moment we're living in, this is the decisive issue. We will allow the government to terrorize us in the name of terrorism. We will allow the government to take away our civil rights in the United States with the Patriot Act. We will stand by and allow the government to subject people to pointless and humiliating searches at airports, which accomplish absolutely nothing. How many absurdities will we accept? Well, I think that maybe we may get to the point where there is one final absurdity that is absolutely unacceptable, and that is the absurdity that completely harmless plants should be forbidden and put under the same code of penalty as crack cocaine.
Well, once again, you and I have been talking about this in the last couple of weeks, and it touches me deeply to have understood with you that it goes very, very deep and wide, because as I see it, it's in fact a separation between human and earth, human and animals, human and stones and minerals, us, the planet, us who are the planet. So I think this is extremely grave. It's extremely grave that it's become dangerous for people to have a Colorado toad as a pet. I mean, as you say, how far will this go?
Would you explain that incident about the Colorado toad, Joanna? Because that came up, and we decided that we would put it on the broadcast. I just want to say that certain toads, you may not know this, are psychoactive, which probably is an explanation of the girl who kisses the toad in fairy tales and he becomes a princess. This is because they have a chemical called bufotenin in the back of on their back, and if you lick the toad, you can get an hallucinogenic effect. And just last week, Joanna pointed out to me a magazine article about this.
Well, I just want to make a disclaimer here. I do not have the American nationality. I am a what they call an alien permanent resident, and I agree with the American government because I love to go to America. My people are in America, all of you, and I'm sure that you understand what I'm saying. Now, I will go back to the toads. I read the other day on Google that there was a very strong consideration by the authorities that the possession of the Colorado toad would be made a felony. So it's like, you know, how far is it going to go? Am I going to be forbidden to kiss my cat, which is one of the greatest joys in my life? Or are we going to be not allowed to milk a cow?
Without going into too much detail, let me explain to you why the sale of fresh mushrooms was recently banned in Holland. Now, some of you may know that when you come to Europe, you can smoke marijuana and hashish in cafes in Holland. We're not talking about those things because we don't consider them to be genuine entheogens. But one of the characteristics of Holland is that they've had a very liberal policy not only toward prostitution but also toward these mind-altering substances. And for a great number of years in the so-called smart shops in Holland, you could buy dried mushrooms and fresh ones and mushroom kits. Well, about 2 years ago, the dried mushrooms were ruled as a Class A drug on the same level as cocaine. And recently, now the legislation is now been put in effect to ban the sale of fresh mushrooms in these smart shops. Why? Because there were two incidents that happened in Holland. One was a young girl fell out or jumped out of a window, and the other one was that some fellow who was a tourist who came to Holland, and as some people do, went straight to the smart shops or the smoking cafes, had a car accident and broke his legs. Now, on the basis of these two incidents, they have introduced through the European community the ban on fresh mushrooms. Now, I ask you, how absurd can you get? How much more absurd does it have to be before we start to wake up and see that there is a systematic program to deny the human beings access to rapturous knowledge and ecstatic knowledge of the earth, which we need for our survival. And that is what the bottom line of the game is. And Joanna and I, as we've been discussing these talks and where we want to go in these 5 discussions, have more or less come to an agreement, and I'll ask her to speak in her own words here, but we've more or less come to an agreement, my friends out there, that this is the deal breaker. This is the deal breaker for the shift. Where you stand on the planetary shift may well be decided by where you stand on this issue of the right to have access to entheogenic plants.
I consider this a very crucial talk, maybe the most important talk of my lifetime. So for those who understand who want to understand what I'm going to say, I'll say this. John just talked about psilocybin being made a Class A drug, just like cocaine. I disagree with cocaine, very strongly, but this is the European Union making the psilocybin mushroom now unavailable. I strongly disagree with the laws, those laws of the European Union. I have a European Union passport, so I am therefore still up till now allowed to disagree with the government of the European Union. But as an alien in the United States, I am not allowed to disagree with the government of the United States. So I think I just want to make this extremely clear.
So these are, in a sense, personal details, but I think you can all realize that there's a global picture in which these personal details are set. And the situation that Joanna describes touches all of us. It touches us all profoundly. It involves all of us. There is no one who is out of reach now of the control of the authorities with their program. And what I hope to get across to you in this talk is that there has to be a point where we realize that that program is absurd and that one has to take a stand.
See, what we are talking about here, and this personal detail that I spoke about a few minutes ago, is we have to defend the right to disagree anywhere in the world with anything that's been done. We cannot be passive, and especially in the separation of human and nature. But here I'd like to ask you, John, a question. So this is very valid if we're speaking about the medicinal plants of the earth. But what about the chemicals, LSD, the chemical LSD, mescaline? What about that?
Well, that brings up the subject of Basel. 2 years ago, we went to a conference in Basel, which was for the 100th anniversary of Albert Hofmann. By the way, there was a newspaper poll in England, and it was for the purpose of determining the 100 greatest geniuses of the 20th century, and the person who came out at the top of that list was Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD in 1943. So anyway, there's another Basel conference in March in Basel, another conference sponsored by Dieter Hagenbach at Gaia Media, and I suspect that one of the main topics of that will be, as it was in the previous conference, that is the legalization of LSD as a drug for psychotherapy, curing of addiction, and so forth. And I suspect that mescaline and psilocybin would be included in the same category as therapeutic drugs. Okay? So Joanna's asking me, what do I think of these particular substances in relation to the medicine plants? Well, of course, they're all illegal now. They have been for some time. And I want to point out something that I said in a previous talk, but it bears repeating, is that previous to the time that LSD was made illegal in connection with the Leary scenario and the whole underground movement, there were tens of thousands, listen to me, literally, I'm not exaggerating, there were tens of thousands of medical and scientific papers, and there had been thousands and thousands of individual case studies showing that LSD had a therapeutic value in dealing with psychosis, addiction, alcoholism, and so forth. So what the people at Gaia Media are doing in the Basel conferences is raising again this question about the validity. They're well aware of the validity of LSD for these purposes. They're very aware of the research record and the documentation, and so they're raising the question, they're pushing the issue, well, why don't we re-legalize LSD, because we live in a very sick society and it's going to help people get better. And they have a very good point. My own position is a bit more rigorous because I do practice entheogenic shamanism more or less strictly, restricted to the plants given by nature. I consider LSD to be an extremely valuable tool for changing consciousness and for re-imprinting psychologically if used correctly. the same for mescaline and psilocybin. But at the end of the day, I only consider them to be sort of trainer wheels. When you take LSD, you're sort of like riding a bike with trainer wheels on. Trainer wheels for the deeper entheogenic experience which comes in nature with the medicine plants given by nature.
I think that's an excellent distinction. However, I would qualify it somewhat differently. In the past, I have had both those experiences. In the past, I have had experience with ayahuasca. I have had experience with psilocybin mushrooms, and I have had experience with LSD. And I can say for myself that when I have taken what's the contrary of organic? Synthetic, exactly. Synthetic mind expanding or band expanding drugs. There you go. Substances. Okay, cancel clear that word. I too have been brainwashed and imprinted. But anyway, when I have taken the synthetics, I would say that I've been it's been much more mental for me. Timothy Leary used to say that it was very erotic, and that he would have extreme erotic pleasure. I have never had that experience. I have felt very much in a mind trip. Whilst when I take Gaian organic substances, when I have in the past, I have felt blissfully connected to the earth from which I come and to which I will return.
Yes, there is a heightening of perceptual focus with these synthetics, but not necessarily this ecstatic connection to the entire field of the natural world and the beauty. And of course, they also have to be taken in the right setting. One of the things that you would find if you went to Holland, or back in the old days when people used to do this and went to the smart shops, is that the mushrooms that were sold fresh came with a little paper explaining, very carefully how they ought to be taken and explaining the doses and so forth. And these entheogenic plants are no different than any other substance in the world, like synthetic substances or even alcohol. You have to be able to take them in a sober and careful way, knowing what you're doing. The difference between them and most of the other addictive substances of our society is that they are basically harmless, and it is extremely difficult for you to harm yourself on them. They're not addictive. Psychoactive mushrooms are not addictive. In fact, they're counter-addictive. And in order to harm yourself on them, you have to use them very recklessly or mix them with other things. So, again, the question arises, if nature provides us, our species, with these 20 or 200 or so plant species, in order to guide us, illuminate, cleanse, and heal us, then what does it come down to when we live in a world where the ultimate taboo has been imposed and we are not allowed to have these substances? I think that's the deal breaker. I think that is what is going to decide the shift and how people take sides in the coming shift of the planet, which many people are talking about.
Well, it's absolutely. Will we speak up for our freedom, or will we allow the few to imprison us in a very small, agreed band of perception?
I think that we're getting down to the last 10 or 15 minutes here, and I think that Joanna would agree that we ought to round off this discussion by talking a little bit about the current memes or the current ideas in discourse regarding planetary shift. Many of these ideas are, and I'm talking here about the counterculture conception, many of these ideas, as you know, are focused on the 2012 date. If you look at Metahistory.org, you'll find the end time articles. I've written, in fact, what amounts to a whole book, a series of, I think, 8 or 9 pieces on 2012, and many people are writing about it. And one of the, I want to address, just as a, to frame our discussion, one of the general conceptions about 2012.
You have a book out.
Yes, and I have a book out called 2012, in which I've contributed, it's brought out by Sounds True, in which I contributed an article. The general concept is, first of all, that the date 2012 is indicated by the Maya calendar, and most people who are into the subject do not consider that literally to mean that the Maya people predicted the end of the world on December 21st, 2012. So we are taking the information from the ancient Maya culture, which disappeared in the 10th century, and we are applying it to our time to try to help us model the planetary crisis we're in, okay? And so we've chosen their end of their calendar as a threshold moment. Doesn't mean the world is going to end. It doesn't mean we're going to have a cataclysmic overthrow of the planet, although there are plenty of reasons for thinking that these events might be coming, but we don't need the Mayan calendar to tell us that, do we? We knew long before this became a mainstream subject that we're heading for an increasingly bumpy ride on the planet. So perhaps the Mayan date, the Mayan end time, as it's called, could be helpful in focusing our collective minds toward a threshold point. Now the question is, what are people saying about what could happen at that threshold point? There are many theories. I'll just mention the most popular one, and the most positive one, and this is being discussed and promoted by people such as John Major Jenkins, who is a Mayanist, and Daniel Pinchbeck and other people. That is the idea that there is a dramatic escalation of humanity toward a shift into a higher state of consciousness, a shift into a state of knowledge and awareness in which we will be more able to manage the crisis on the planet, and which we may even be able to produce a mid-course correction and divert ourselves from some of the catastrophes that seem inevitable down the road. Other people, such as Barbara Marx Hubbard, whom is a close colleague of Joanna, have presented this same scheme in terms of the noosphere of Teilhard de Chardin, and they have embellished the idea that humanity is evolving on a spiral of evolution toward higher and higher consciousness, and perhaps the year 2012 would be, again, a breakthrough into that higher consciousness. So all this is good news. This is positive, it's inspiring, it's hopeful. Many people embrace this particular vision of planetary shift.
Yes, and I intend to do a series of talks soon where I will first interview people like James Lovelock, and I invite him right now, and Ralph Metzner, who says that he thinks that we might be cooked as a species, but yet we have to work and we have to be present every day without any thoughts of the outcome. And I also want to interview John Lash, who's skeptic about our survival. And then I want to interview a group of people who are very upbeat and hopeful about the transformation that can come about.
I think that in terms of the media that we're using here to reach you, and the internet as a tool of communication, internet radio and conferences and even YouTube this is the best place for us to have this discussion. And this is a really crucial discussion. I think it's brilliant of Joanna to have thought this up, because we really need to hear both sides of it. I need to hear both sides, because I hold a certain view which is not the positive, hopeful view that I just outlined, but I am open to hear from people who hold that view, and I think that sorting this out in the airwaves where people can listen to it and form their own opinions is going to be exciting and an extremely valuable exercise.
Well, I think we'll soon bring this talk to a close, and we'd love to hear from you on this subject, which really is, to me, the subject of heartfelt, spiritual, and intellectual freedom. So, Joanna at metahistory.org.
Yes, and just before we sign off, Joanna, I'd like to signal the listeners to a website and to a whole movement. In fact, as far as I can tell, it's a sort of movement that is intimately connected with the question we have raised here today. If you go on the net and go to Pharmacratic Inquisition, you'll find a website, of course, and other related websites. The Pharmacratic Inquisition itself seems to be presented by a group called, curiously enough, Gnostic Media. So I quite resonate to that, because I'm a node of Gnostic Media myself. And the message of the Pharmacratic Inquisition is very relevant to our talks here for two reasons. First of all, they are raising the subject into high focus of the taboo that has been placed on ecstasy, rapture, and the higher knowing that we acquire through medicine plants. They are raising that issue to a very high level of controversy, and they are warning the world that there is an inquisition in progress, a pharmacratic inquisition, with the intention of putting these plants permanently under taboo and cracking down absolutely on every aspect of access to the ecstatic knowing of nature. So they're doing quite a job there. They've bitten off quite a task for themselves. But I would point out that there are close parallels between what the Pharmacratic Inquisition people are doing and what I have said in my book, Not in His Image. Not in His Image is a definitive condemnation of salvationist religion, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and it points or signals the return to this direct visionary experience of nature along the lines of the Gnostic model. And these are ideas, I think, that ought to be known and discussed by every enlightened person in our time. And one of the things that you will find when you go to the Pharmacratic Inquisition site is a little type of YouTube clip in which they present a variation of the Wasson thesis. Remember, that was the subject of our first talk. And one of the variations of the Wasson thesis was presented by a Gnostic scholar, actually, named John Allegro. And John Allegro wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross in the late 60s. And in that book, he claimed that Christianity was originally a mushroom cult, and that Jesus was just a code name for the mushroom that they ingested. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that particular variation of the Wasson thesis. I myself don't go for that particular variation, but this is something that one needs to know about to be informed about the subject we're discussing here. And so you'll find a little 6 or 7 minute clip on the Allegro variation of the Wasson thesis on the site of Pharmacratic Inquisition. So that's about all we have for today, and Joanna's holding up a finger. She wants to make one more comment, so I'll let her sign off, and I will go off and slink away into the silence as I usually do.
Well, I want to leave you with a question. Will we women be once again burnt at the stake? or by microwave, whatever they're called, because of our intimate knowledge and relationship with the healing plants of the earth. See you next time.
Thank you, Joanna. I'd like to start by making two remarks. First, briefly, by referring back to the overall title, Rapture and Revolution. I find these two words in juxtaposition to be quite compelling, and I reflect on them a lot. Listeners of the preceding installments of this series will recall, I think, that we said in the first discussion of the Wasson thesis something about this title, and I just want to reiterate that briefly. The title reflects the idea that we have in a great possibility. And this is not our idea of Joanna Harcourt-Smith and John Lash, but I would say that it's an idea that we encountered together in our generation. I would say that it's an idea of the 60s generation, which was that by changing consciousness, we could change the world. Now, we understand in the perspective of 40 years of time now, we perhaps understand that with a little more maturity and a little more depth. For one thing, I would say that changing consciousness involves going into ecstasy and trance. That has been the time-tried method. That is the tradition of shamanism. That is the sacred tradition of medicine plants reflected in all indigenous cultures. And so I would add that the experience of rapture is the consciousness-changing experience, a certain band that is of our conceptual framework. And the plants, it's as if nature provided us with a means to get over ourselves and get outside of that. And that's what the sacred plants are, but that is not what drugs are. Drugs, most drugs, prescription drugs, laboratory-produced drugs, simply produce an alteration within the band we're in, and they derange that band or give us an illusory sense of flexibility within that band. But what we're talking about, and exactly what Carlos was talking about, is about shifting bands deliberately, moving to other bands of organization, and for instance, seeing the universe in true perceptions and true hallucinations. When shamans paint pictures that show microscopic structure of the universe, it's not an artistic fantasy. They do this, ayahuasca shamans for instance, because they are actually able to directly perceive the molecular structure. I have done that myself. I know that it's a fact. I can do it repeatedly and deliberately, but I cannot do it without the aid of the medicine plants. Likewise, it's possible to perceive on the macrocosmic scale, to look into the interior of the sun, to look at the center of the galaxy. These perceptions are all within the range of the human mind. And what we are proposing in this title, Rapture and Revolution, is that the act of having these perceptions...
Hello everybody at Future Primitive. We are doing the fourth talk of Rapture and Revolution. And I'm here with John. We're, I think, at a very exciting place in this series of talks. Up till now, we've spoken about the history of mind-expanding substances, mainly plants, and we've spoken about the effects of them, the connection between the earth and the connection with these substances. We've spoken about what we may see when we expose ourselves to this perception. And now we are going to talk about what we are calling the Planetary Shift Society, or the Species. So this is really the practical application or the destructive application of these tools. So, John, how would you like to start this portion?
The most powerful we know.
Well, I'd like to refer back to Castaneda about this. He spoke about bands, and so I see it a little bit like we are stuck in a radio station, at a particular radio station, and we can be willing to search for other bands and other reception.
Yes, that's brilliant. I find that Castaneda's model is very helpful. Those of us who say Castaneda, by the way, give away our age, because we're old enough to remember when the books came out with a little squiggle over the end. Most people say Castaneda. Anyway, Carlos, or Carlitos, as we like to call him, came up with a fascinating model of bands of emanation, and his description of changing consciousness was very simple. I like to go by Carlos's description of shamanism or sorcery, which is, it's the management of perception. And he spoke of heightened perception as the state that we achieve when we go out of the habitual band that we're in into these other bands. So what we're saying here that integrates closely with Carlos's work is that the sacred plants have been given to us by nature so that we can move through other bands. As human beings endowed with the particular cerebral faculties that we have, and with our language skills and symbol-making skills, we tend to niche ourselves into perceptions of doing the practices that it takes is also connected with the act of revolution and changing the society that we live in. So with that preface, I'd like to go on to the idea of the society versus the species. I brought that notion up as a conflict situation in metahistory a few years ago. And I'd like to just say briefly what I mean by that conflict. It's very simple. If you out there, those of you who are listening to these words, find that in some respects, and perhaps in many respects, you're living in an inhumane society, an inhumane world, then I would ask you, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stay in that inhumane society and try to make it into a humane society? Or are you going to do something else? And if you decide to do something else, what are your options?
Well, I saw this great cartoon in the New Yorker, in the latest copy of the New Yorker, and some of you will understand this joke because I'm not going to elaborate on it, but it's two girlfriends sitting having tea, and one says to the other, well, you're just still angry because he slept with his avatar. And just, like that. Okay, I'll give you a clue.